Right, that everybody else is muted as they should be. And let's get back to the main screen here. Anita, now we've got
Hello.
53 people on board. Please tell us a bit
Hello.
about yourself for a few minutes, so we can allow a few more people to get in. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Hello, everybody. Even though we might not be able to see each other, but it's wonderful to know you're there. My name is Anita Quye, and I'm very delighted to be asked to talk to you this afternoon for the historical group for the RSC. So a little bit about myself. Well, first of all, my pronunciation of my name is Quye. It doesn't sound like it should be a British name, but it's really old. We're in the Domesday Book. I think we were Normanised. So I think there's somewhere called Stoke-on-Quye near Cambridge, and that's where the name derivates. I was brought up near London, so the subject I'm going to talk to you about today is really close to my heart, and it's wonderful to be able to research something that is on your home patch. I have been up in Scotland for many more years than I care to remember. Schooled up here, went to Strathclyde University for my first degree, did a chemistry degree there, really loved the applied aspects of what they taught or how they taught us at Strathclyde University. Very fortunate to work with Dick Petherick and David Littlejohn, particularly. Going forward, John Liggett as well. So I did my degree at Strathclyde University in the mid-80s. I then did a PhD over at Glasgow University, which for a Scottish student was quite a transition to go across the other side of the city. Did my PhD there in forensic toxicology with Bob Anderson, all set for a forensic pathway at that point. I had my chartered chemist status by then. Was expecting to either go into the pharmaceutical industry or into forensic, and ended up working for National Museums of Scotland because they were looking for an analytical chemist who could look at small samples of organic materials using chromatography. So I chanced my luck, was delighted to be offered the position, and was there from 1989 up until 2010. Doing all sorts of amazing analysis, very privileged analysis with the national collections and other museum collections as well. Met Peter through that connection, through the Science Museum connection. And then in 2010, I felt I had a lot of information about all these amazing materials and collections, and just wanted to go and share it with teaching students. And sharing that knowledge with the heritage science or the cultural heritage industry as well, sector. So in 2010, I went back to Glasgow University now for my lecturing post in history of art. So quite a big circuitous thing. Ended up back in the building where forensics started off from. So University Gardens was where forensic was, and it's now history of art. I've been there for the past 13 years. I am now Professor of Heritage Science, teaching about dyes, plastics, synthetic materials, etc. But today I'm going to be talking to you about this amazing collection, which I'm, like I say, very privileged to get access to all these wonderful historical items. And so today I wanted to tell you a little bit about a dying family and their legacy of books that they left, which is now in Southwark Archives. So, Peter, would you like me to?
Yes, thank you very much, Anita. Very good introduction there, and we seem to have stabilised at around 56. Well, going down. Anyway, we've got 54 people at the moment, and please, could you talk to us about creative chemistry inside the 18th century Crutchley dye houses in London?
I'd be delighted to, and you might have to be keeping an eye on the clock for me, Peter, because I can go on for a long time. So hopefully I can cover this. So what I thought I would do, I could sort of like focus very much on the chemistry of what I'm going to talk to you about, but I thought we could just take a step back from it and just think about very practical application of using colored chemicals to create products, to make things, and in this case it'll be like dyeing textiles in London. So I'm not going to layer too much of the ins and outs of the chemical processes, but I just want to tell you about how dyers from 300 years ago were using chemistry without thinking about what they were doing in that scientific sense, but just as very creative, practical colour artists, for want of a better word, craftspeople in their skills. So what I'm going to use for this talk is this absolutely incredible archive. I'll tell you a little bit about the history of it. But these are books that exist to that dyers wrote their information into. There are not many of them, they're very scarce. But what this particular one that I'm going to tell you about gives us an insight into is dyeing textiles that were leaving from London 300 years ago, so around about sort of 1720s up to about 1750s. And it's all happening on the shores of the River Thames. So before I sort of like tell you a bit more about that archive, let me just sort of show you what kind of things they are. Hopefully this image is okay to use. It seems to have public domain status from Wikimedia. So this example here, which is in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, is a very fine example of the kind of cloth that this particular dye company was dyeing. You can see it's here it's made into a military jacket. It's a very typical use for it. It's a very hard-wearing woolen cloth. It's quite a famous one known as broadcloth, which some of you might have heard about. It's got a very good waterproofing qualities to it. This was one kind of cloth that this particular dye company was colouring, but this is just to give you an example of the kind of product it was used for. Waistcoats, women's clothing, cloaks, that kind of very practical textile. But the colours of it, broadcloth tends to be thought of in terms of, like example here, dyed blue or dyed red, but as we'll see, this particular dye company in London was creating very fashionable colours, and I'll tell you why it's so special as I go through it rather than sort of preempting it. So anyways, this is the kind of thing I want to keep in mind about where these cloths were going to. I'll start where I started with this collection. So way back in 2014, part of my research interest is using chromatography, ultra high performance liquid chromatography with a photodiode array detector. I can use these techniques to look at solvent extracts of dyed fibers from historical objects, to look at the chemical composition of what those dyes are, and then to be able to match up that chemical composition with known references of what dyes have been in the past. So my area that I've developed has been around natural dyes and more lately about synthetic dyes, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the chemistry of those in a moment. But in 2014, I had been looking at some books in the National Archive at Kew Garden. I was interested, they'd asked me to come and have a look at some records that they had there. So, like I say, dyers kept books of their practices. They are quite rare in the UK, although British textile industry is very important. It's a very big part of textile history, and it's known to be a very large industry at the time, but there's not much left of it. And the reason is that these books held kind of like trade secrets. So 300 years ago, the ones that I was looking at in the National Archive were very much of their time. They were protected knowledge that sat within a particular dye company or a dye house. They were often personal to the dyers that wrote them. So it'd be individuals writing about their daily work, keeping a note of what they were dyeing with, the temperatures, the conditions they were using. And if we're lucky, we can sometimes find these dye books and they've got little samples of dyed textiles in along with them. But because they were protected knowledge, because they were quite specific to a profession, they didn't get appreciated and recognised for what they have been. So a lot of them actually been destroyed. for virtue of a company being bought out or closing, or because they were such protected knowledge, they almost kind of like died with the dyer, if you see what I mean. They weren't necessarily passed on. And then in families' possessions, maybe they weren't recognised for what they were, or because of their fragility, they just haven't survived as well. So that's what makes them different and unusual. So when I was at the National Archive, looking at particular dye books that they had there, somebody mentioned, oh, if you're interested in what we've got here, you might want to go to Southwark Local History Archive in Southwark, the Borough of London, because they've got a collection there that we've heard of. And I think they'd be very interested in having somebody to go along and see if they can help them understand what they have. So this was literally a photograph from my very first visit. The person that's in the picture there is Patricia Dark, Dr. Patricia Dark, who's the head archivist for Southwark. And I have to be honest, I didn't have great expectations for what I was going to be shown, because we can get so often disappointed with thinking, there's going to be some actually amazing sort of like a collection additional to what we already knew about for British textile history. But Patricia took this very unassuming box. You can see the grey box there on the table in front of her, and she just started taking out the most unbelievable collection of books that I had seen. And it literally within just a minute or so of seeing what she was putting on the table, I thought, this is really special. This is something that's not even just like British history important, but it's wider than this. It's sort of telling us about a period in time where things get very interesting in Europe in terms of creating colours to sell cloth. So in Britain, making really good quality woolen cloth was a very big thing since the medieval period, particularly important in the sort of 16th, 17th century, dye producing areas in Gloucestershire and Worcestershire, around London as well, Norwich for shawls, very important part of the economy. And in this period of 1700s was just the start of the huge textile industry for Britain, and its competitiveness with Europe. So I got very excited about what Patricia was showing me. They were very excited that I was excited. I put together a very privileged to be able to invite into the research team Dr. Dominique Cardon, who's a esteemed dye researcher, dye historian, and equally esteemed as Dr. Jenny Balfour-Paul. So Dominique is at the CNRS, or she's now emeritus, CNRS in Lyon, and Jenny is a research fellow associated with University of Exeter as well. So between the three of us, we had the task of understanding what these books were. I could see how amazing they were. They were obviously very old. They were all handwritten. They had a lot of text in them. There was 15 books, a lot of text, dyed samples pinned into them. You can see a book in the bottom row that's got some names and some numbers beside it. So there was also sort of ledgers of accounts for it as well. So what we knew about this collection, and this is what makes it really special, is that the books had been kept in the possession of a family, the Crutchley family, who had donated them in 2011 to Southwark. They'd kept them in their possession because 300 years previous to that, their family had set up a dye works very much within just about 500 metres of where Southwark Archive is today, so right on the shores of the River Thames. And what they knew about was that the company was set up by somebody called John Crutchley, that his family were involved in making this dye business very successful. And John Crutchley became known as the dyer of Southwark, was very famous for dyeing scarlet colours as well. He died in 1728, and these books, from what we could see at the very start, because they weren't in any particular order, we could see sort of dates in them, and we could understand that they probably went up to about 1744. But in terms of what they were telling us, we really had, Dominique and Jenny and I had to really look very closely at what the text was and use our understanding and knowledge of historical dyeing to understand what these books were. So we set about that. We were starting off, like I say, from knowledge that the dye works happened on the River Thames. So this is looking from the north side of the river, so standing kind of like near St. Paul's Cathedral, looking across the river. So you can see the Shard, a very famous landmark. There's two places that were very important and that we found mentioned in the will, because the family had these books in their possession. They also had a lot of business records as well, which were in a private collection of theirs, which Jenny was able to go and see much more closely for us. So we're very grateful to Annie Crutchley for that. And in the wills, John Crutchley mentioned about leaving two dye houses and messuage, which is like the buildings and all the outhouses, along with it in his will to his family. And he mentions his sons, Thomas Crutchley, and other sons as well. He had 4 of them and a daughter called Anne as well. So they were all sort of like involved with the business. And he mentioned the maze. Now the maze is in the footprint of Thomas and Guy's Hospital, just at that part of Southwark. Some people might know it for that. So they mentioned the maze. Today it is buildings, it's roads, it's beside London Bridge train station. But back in 1700s, it had a big pond there. So the River Thames is an estuary, and it used to flood into parts of London, and this was a part called the Maze Pond area. So there's a lot of industries that are working there, hatters and dyers, and it was sort of very famous for that. So it all sort of made sense. And they also mentioned Clink Street, which is where, if you know, anybody knows Clink Street Prison, which is now a famous sort of tourist attraction, that is the footprint of where they were. So the road that leads from round where the prison is towards Borough High Street Market. There's a Vinters that's in that part now, wine merchants. That's where their buildings were. And like I say, Borough High Street is just a hop and a skip away from there. It was all very exciting to see that. And when we looked, we found a set of Georgian maps that have been published, a very famous set of Georgian maps from 1740s, and on the site of where Clink Street's mentioned, we find a dye house actually on the map there. So we believe that this is the Crutchley dye house. So we set about investigating it in great detail, a lot of text writing. You can see Dominique using a handheld instrument on the right hand side to measure colour for the dyed textiles, and we only gave ourselves about 1.5 years or something like that, on and off, to look at the books. But what we found was something quite remarkable, in that the books did have a great deal of connection to each other. A lot of them were dated. We found in the 15 books, we reckon there's about sort of nearly 1,000 or about 1,200 dyed textile samples pinned into the books. There's a few of them missing, but mostly pinned into the books. There are hundreds of dyeing recipes, and very importantly, I'll talk about it in a moment, instructions from the actual dyers saying this is what we did on a daily basis, and lots of little notes and memorandums and things. I've not seen anything like this. It's unique as for British history, and as what we know for other dyeing as well. But there's a sequence to it, and it goes from 1722 is the first, 1721 is the first dated book, up to 1744 is the last dated entry. There's also little inserts in the book that come from much earlier as well. The consequence, I'll sort of jump to the tasty bit of it, was the consequence was that from our research we were able to put it forward with Patricia to nominate it for the UNESCO UK Memory of the World Register, and it is now inscripted. We're absolutely thrilled. It's the first sort of dye history inscription. This preserves it. This recognizes it as like a really special part of history that needs to get preserved, that it deserves to be known about as well. So we were absolutely delighted, although it came just as we were all locking down. So it was a lovely bit of news, but we couldn't really do very much with it apart from enjoy what potential there was for later. So what I'm going to talk about is oops, sorry, just to show you what some of them look like inside. What I'm going to talk about is the sort of dyeing practices, and the books mention repeatedly something called graining. They talk about out of grain and they talk about in grain. And Dominique immediately went, oh, I recognize what this is. This is definitely a skilled way of using particular kind of dyes to dye red coloured cloth. So as we are tuned into what these dyed samples were, and it has taken about 10 years for it to really process quite what we were seeing, and we're still, every time I look at this, every time we look at it together, we see more and more that we can talk about and understand, but it makes so much sense in terms of what we understand about textile history and dyeing at this point. So this is where we focused our attention. And as I said, there was really fabulous bits of information in it. So there's the instructions. This is like the writing down of the dyeing process, almost step by step. The earliest books give that very instructional information. This was noting in supreme detail. I mean, it's down to like, you know, use certain water at this point and be sure to stir it here or to do whatever. The directions were also in one particular book. There's about 4 or 5 pages that were at the start of one of the earliest books that's in the collection. And you can see how fragile the pages are. We had to work very delicately. We were utterly privileged to do this. And because we've had it UNESCO recognized now, I don't think we're ever going to get the chance to get so close to it again. So that's a bit ironic that by very virtue of understanding what it is, we've now not got that direct privilege quite so much for the fantastic access that Patricia and her team gave to us and the trust that they had with us for moving it and manipulating it and things. But the directions are really important. That was like gold. It was like real insight into the real secrets of what the Crutchleys were doing in their dye house. So it was owned and managed by them, and occasionally there's bits of hints from them talking about like the River Thames, for example, that we knew these were definitely connected to their dyeing practice. And also memorandums. These are handy little notes that they inserted every so often to sort of like talk about advisory information, what to look out for the dyeing with it. Now this period is all using natural dyes and natural dyeing agents and minerals and things like that as well. So there's a lot of variation in what the dye quality. They probably were purchasing things that were coming into London, into the ports into London. These dyes were coming from around the globe. Certain dyes would become dye stuffs from plants and insects, and from lichens would be very well known, and the dyes that they use were ones that were famously understood for that time. So they give that kind of advice. So this is what the instructions look like. Some of it was written in Flemish, which we now understand, and there's direct translations. So there's a sort of master apprentice or master to master, we think, transmission of information, which again has been written about and is known about, but no evidence in quite the way as what they've got in this Crutchley archive. So quite remarkable. And there's literal translations of a text in Flemish translated into English with dyed samples along with it as well. So it's like someone's conveying their knowledge, somebody's trying it and seeing if they can get the same result as well. Very, very exciting. And this is some of the oldest entries in the book that go back to 1716 as well, when John Crutchley was just starting out. So this is an example, the kind of text, you can see the kind of what sort of things we had challenges. We had bits of pages missing. We were reading longhand script, things that people, I'm sure, that have working on historical documents were very familiar with. There was very archaic terms. So this is where I'm glad I was a chemist student of the 80s, because things like aquafortis and that kind of stuff was still being bandied around in my training. So I had an idea that we were talking about, like, nitric acid, for example, these kind of things, but there's quite a lot of other sort of like antiquated ways of describing things. However, once we tuned our eyes in, and again, from our understanding of things, it wasn't as difficult as it looked like. There's a lot of repetition as well. So what we found, because we literally had to reorder the books, they had been given a museum number that just sequenced them, or given a sequential numbering, I think, just as they came out of the boxes that were from the donation. So we had to reorder them, and once we kind of understood what the books were, I took a very small number of samples. I mentioned there about over 1,000 dyed samples. You'd think I'd go crazy and start sampling left, right, and centre, but before we knew how important the book was, or the books were, I was thinking, we've got a lot of written information. We just need to confirm as much as we can what was written in the text matches up with the dyes that are in the dyed samples. So that was the technique we used. I had two wonderful PhD students with me who were in their postdoc phases, Julie Wirtz and Jing Han, who supported the analysis with me, and were able to sort of like prove that the dyes that the dyers wrote about in the books did indeed match, on the majority of times, the dyed samples as well. So that gave us a good starting point for that. So what I now can see looking back is that in this period up to 1728, it's the first sort of like, I don't know, 12 years or so of the what's recorded in these books, the Crutchleys were very much establishing their dyeing technique for dyeing wool. Now, the important thing is that London plays a really important part in this colouring of textiles. The 1700s become a time of, as I mentioned, textile industry really ramping up in Europe, and also fashion colours. Up to this point, there's a lot of really beautiful colours that have been made. They're appreciated for their colours. Quite a lot of the colours were status symbols. So, the scarlet colours would be, yes, they were available to people to have in their sort of everyday lives, but they were very much a high status item in terms of the dyeing materials, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in this period of 1716, 1720, there's a lot written around about 1750 onwards from a textile history perspective about fashion colours and development. But this period between 1700 and 1750, in terms of like physical evidence, there's not much apart from now the wonderful Crutchley archive. And what we see through the books is that they established their technique using a practice that was very much embedded in the couple of centuries before, a technique called graining, which I've mentioned and I'll go into in a moment. And it's almost like I say, this is around when John Crutchley is starting up his business and is now working with his family to produce the textiles, probably with other people in their workforce as well. They're establishing this graining technique to make certain colours. But as we'll see in a moment, in 1736, they become much more making fashion colours. And the reason that this is so important for London is because London became a centre for merchants understanding what the market was for selling things. So they were bringing back information to the dyers in the 1700s and saying, we know that clients want a particular kind of colour of red or a particular shade of this, or this colour selling really well. The Levant, for example, was a very big sort of conduit to markets, also markets through Antwerp, for instance, as well. And London, the regions, so in Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, Norwich, places like that, dyers would be working with the textile makers, so that the weavers and the merchants locally. But in London, the merchants were asking for the good quality cloths, or any kind of quality cloths, to come through to London undyed, and the dyers in London would dye them to these requirements. So this was the London merchants really getting the most out of the saleability of the colours, and the Crutchleys are very much part of that, and that's what we see in their techniques. So 1716 to 1728, they start off using natural dyes. So this is a selection of more than what the Crutchleys were using, but just showing you the kind of chemical components for them. So they're all aromatics, they're chromophoric. These are dye molecules that exist in plant roots, plant leaves. Cochineal is an insect, for example. Neoflavonoids that we see there, this is from the woods, the heartwood of trees, this particular case, logwood and Brazilwood. Aucenes are compounds that are found in natural lichens, which were also used. And then we've got indigoids and tannins being plant sourced as well. So the ones that the Crutchleys specialized in were using the anthraquinone dyes. So a dye called madder and a dye called cochineal. And they also used neoflavonoids, which are not as fast to light. They tend to degrade a bit more, but they became very useful to the Crutchleys for shading things. And what the Crutchleys were doing, as I mentioned, is what other dyers were doing in Europe and in Britain as well. So they weren't doing anything special, but what their special thing is that they're showing us and giving us first-hand evidence of what was happening with these dyes. So yes, so the anthraquinones are the ones to focus on. So a nice molecule that unless it's attached to the textile fibers, then it doesn't last very long. The color's not very great, but there's a certain technique called mordanting, which uses a mineral salt, alum, and in this case a tin-based salt as well, tin oxides, that give very great colors. So these mordants are really important. Even in this time, the 1700s and before this, in fact, going back to Henry VIII's time, dyers talked about brightening and saddening their colors, and it depended on the mordants that they used along with the dyes. So we see here one of those anthraquinone compounds is alizarin, which is from natural madder. And there still is quite a lot of debate about how what this complexation actually looks like. It's one of these wonderful sort of like a very practical chemistry things that nobody's got the answer to quite yet, even despite all these amazing sort of like techniques that we have and amazing sort of like current science. But the two that the Crutchleys specialized in were using aluminium, so alum, which is a mixture of aluminium, potassium phosphates, and tin-based things. Although I've got tin chloride here, they were using tin oxides. So they were producing bright colors in terms of like how the dyers mentioned them. So this is some examples of here using alizarin. It's got a slightly orange kind of color to the samples I've got here, but you can get a much redder color in the hands of very expert dyers. Jing was a very expert dyer, but it can get even brighter colors than that. So in terms of what the Crutchleys were doing, we realized we knew it was quite complex, and we looked at the instructions and the information that was in there. So it did take a lot of brain power to really work out quite what they were talking about. But what they were doing were they were working in grain, which is very specifically working with cochineal. So they used cochineal madder with the two red dyes of importance, and they would use cochineal specifically with tin spirits, and I'll come to that in a moment. So it's a solution of tin oxides acidified, and that was their ingraining techniques. That was quite expensive because cochineal was expensive, tin was expensive. That gave the really brilliant scarlet colors. They could also work out of grain as well, so they did this to recycle their expensive dye baths for graining. So again, this wasn't unusual, but it was what dyers were doing that were in this business. And when they did in-grain colors, they specifically mentioned that. And when they did out of grain, they could change the colors very slightly, so they got more shading on them. So I've mentioned here cherry colors, sort of like violet colors. So they started to take these red colors and they could expand, for want of a better word, their sort of like chroma, their sort of color hues that were on them. And they used a couple of techniques. They would first of all have to boil and prepare these undyed cloths that they were receiving from different parts of at that time England. So they would boil it up, they would scour the cloth, remove any detritus that was there from the wool, and then they would then do their dyeing preparation with it. They don't mention mordanting as a specific word at all in the books. They talk about it as part of the boiling process. So in that boiling step, they were adding what we now term as mordant. Mordant's French word meaning to bite. We see it a lot more in the in Dyer's books. I don't know if it just was the Crutchleys decided not to use it, or if it's something that the British textile industry wasn't using. Need to sort of like drive down a bit deeper into that, but that's for another day. So they used the dyes that were in the little red box. They used the mordants in their boiling. And the tin spirits, they were taking tin alloy, so they would take pewter, which had quite a high percentage of tin in it, dissolve it in nitric acid. But it was a very special and clever way that they had to do it. And the technique was developed in the early 1600s by Drebbel, a Dutch dyer, and his son, who took it on and developed it further. And as it turned out, in the north part of London, in Bow by Bromley, was where the scarlet dyers that specialized in this graining technique had set themselves up, and they've been there, like I say, since the 1640s, still sort of like going there into the 18th century that the Crutchleys existed. We don't know yet, but we wonder if there was a physical kind of interaction between the dyers, the Crutchleys, and those working in Bow and Bromley to learn these techniques. They are quite specific in how they use it. It's a slightly different method that they use in the Crutchley dye house, which seems to be how they were using it in Bow and Bromley, from what we can see from the written evidence so far. That is different to the sort of more sort of like mainstream sort of recorded information as a book called The Whole Art of Dyeing from 1706, a published book that gives away some of these trade secrets. But there's a little bit of a mismatch between what it says in those books and what it says in the Crutchley archive books as well. So they would take the alloy, they would sort of steep it in nitric acid. It was a very careful process. I was reading something today from 1903 that was talking about this tin spirits, and 1903 it seems like a big leap away, but actually that was still within living memory. The dyers that are working then, living memory of them using natural dyes if they were working and practicing before 1850, because that's around about the time that 1860s is when synthetic dyes came in. So within living knowledge in 1903, the author of the book I was reading was talking about tin spirits and how careful they had to make them because they didn't want to form sort of metastannous compounds, which didn't dissolve, didn't give a good colour, didn't work basically. So it was a very careful process, and they mention about the techniques that the Crutchleys were doing. And then the Crutchleys then, like other dyers, were using sort of dyeing agents to change the pH of things as well. So they could use potassium carbonates. They could use argol, cream of tartar, sort of like slightly acidic, just to nuance that pH and create colours. So the kind of things that oh sorry, that's just the what they were doing. So the thing that makes a Bromley and Bow technique is that the dyers there were very specific about using salt, bay salt, which is salt from recovered from the sea, yes, so that's quite specific. And I put here the edge on sample, so you can see the red colour on the fabric. Can you see there's a white centre to it? This is because the thickness of the cloth, this really good quality, in this case it is a broadcloth, a long cloth. The dye doesn't penetrate into the dye fabric, so it's actually quite an economical way of using these very expensive cochineal tin dyeing agents to create really good colors that are actually very fast to light into, relative to what natural dyes stability is. So this is a very telltale sign of knowing that we are looking at, if we found this kind of fabric in a finished garment, for example, and we could see that white core to it, we'd know it had been dyed in this dyeing technique, this graining dyeing technique, just by virtue of the penetration of the dye materials into the cloth. So this, the little coloured table there is my kind of interpretation, a way of trying to visualise the colours that they were producing in 1720s, and you can see the actual dyed samples on the pages there. So quite a range from sort of bluish purple things that we'd get with like raising the pH up, to making things slightly more acidic and taking them down into sort of orange colours. So that gives us a very good indication of that. So we worked through those books, got this kind of understanding about this as the core techniques for the Crutchleys in this period. Something that's really important to them, and they mention it over and over again, is the quality of the water. And London and Southwark was actually very well serviced for water. They put in all sorts of water pipes and amazing irrigation. I never knew so much about London. It was marvelous. Like I say, being a child of London, brought up in that part from, East Ham and West Silvertown and all those kind of places, to know that this, to really walk the streets and understand and live this history was just utterly, yeah, it makes me very emotional just thinking about it. But there was a lot of waterways taking the River Thames water. The quality of the water in Southwark at that time was actually pretty good. And it had to be because there was lots of industries that were working around there that needed good quality water. There was big areas of fields that were available for tentering, so like pegging out the cloths to dye them and to bleach them, that were all within sort of reach of the Crutchley Clink Street dye works as well. So yeah, plentiful water. They would use bran, so actual bran to clear water, which I think is, people use that as a technique today as well, sort of eco-friendly way of doing it. You get bran you can put into your water butts if you're collecting your water for your garden today. They were doing that. And they were also had access to natural spring water as well. So that would be more alkaline. The geology of London is very much sort of like on this sort of chalk and lime. So they had two different ways that they control the water. So they could control their pH through the water as much as the agents that they put into the dye bath. Just recently, in the past couple of years, I've been focusing much more onto the colour creation that they've been doing 1736, 1744. And it's been very interesting. So I've just written a chapter for a book about revolutions in colour, and it really made me start to think less like, well, I think less and less like a chemist. I have to say, chemistry is always there in the background for me. I'm always thinking about materials and why, but I'm absolutely fascinated by putting that into a practical sense. So being able to think about what the Crutchleys were doing in terms of this fashion contribution to fashion colours has been really revelationary for me, and so I'm delighted to have a chapter coming out quite soon on this. But they have quite a different look to the book. So you can see now, these books are like really big tomes. They're kind of like A2 size books. I mean, they're huge, really neatly laid out now. You can see how nicely cut the fabrics are. They're all dated. They give the client name. It's just absolutely incredible. And as we go through them, we start to see that there's slightly different things. They've got a lot of what they were doing already, but they now are introducing another couple of other dyes. So they use something called fustics, which are plant dyes, plant yellows, and weld as well. And they're using different qualities of madder. So they talk about umbro and gamine, which are just different qualities to do with the thickness of the madder root and the kind of how much tannins might be present, which would give a slightly brownish quality to it. They also start talking about cochineal, damaged cochineal, which means cochineal that's been transported on ships and has been exposed to water, seawater. And we analysed some dyeings that had damaged cochineal and what they classed as good cochineal. We couldn't see any chemical difference in terms of what's residing on the textile in terms of the dyed results. but they must be able to buy it cheaper. So this is really interesting because this is a way, using these yellow dyes and these different qualities of dyes is a way of, they are signaling that they are now really going for color, and they're trying to make things so like more yellow, which gives a much more sort of scarlet, fiery color. That could be for cheapness. These Fustics and the Weald were quite cheap dyes. And it could also be about hitting that mark for making the most sort of like slightly orangier, fierier colors, which are very marketable as well. But they're using many other things that are familiar as well. So they're building on their existing skills and taking it forward. And they start doing much more of recycling of their dye baths, to become much more economical. They then can make all these beautiful shades. So if you hold in mind all those sort of really rich colors that they had pre-1728, now we've got these really delicate colors. They call them flesh, blossom, lavender. They actually name them lavender blossom, thyme blossom. They talk about yolk colors for yellows. These are all still dyed. Hopefully you can kind of see there's a sort of reddishness to them. Even the silver is done as a recycled bath. So they're now getting more creative in their color creation. They were using the boiling step to introduce a bit of color. It wasn't just about using the mordants at that bit with a little tiny bit of madder or whatever. They were now starting to create base colors in that first bit, and they could create this sort of silver color that they're very proud of. And they could also make mock crimson, so sort of imitation crimson as well, in sort of much cheaper ways too. But then they were doing their graining. You can see that one in the middle, the scarlet, there's a very bright yellow sample there. So what these samples, what they show in the books is like their stages of dyeing. So in that particular day, back in, July 1738, for Mr., was it George, can't make out his name, but anyway, whoever he was, his dye, his particular red, was created by putting down a bright yellow with the Fustics and then dyeing and graining on the top of it. So you can see the word graining there. So this really pops out the color. And I tell you, looking through those books was just, you couldn't believe they'd been made 300 years ago. Absolutely beautiful. And this sort of maps on to the kind of fashion colors that are known to be in textile history. And when I mapped out onto this table and kind of did a sort of timeline of the colors that they were producing, you can see that we now get sort of like certain colors coming into their crafting. So yellows and golds and buff colors, which look almost nondescript on the textile, are now sort of like starting to come in, and really sort of changing their sort of palette that they were offering, sort of much deeper colors. They've got names. Visni means cherry, like sour cherry in Turkish. Could be hitting the mark for maybe their markets that they were selling to through their merchanting agents. And it's kind of turning thoughts to these kind of, we expect like the red colors, you know, if we're going to look for textiles dyed in Britain in the 1700s, where they're all just scarlets. No, they're not. They're these beautiful colours, which are evident in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, for example. There's examples in there of these, but they're usually quite embellished with metal threads and all sorts of decorative elements. That the background colour of the wool cloth disappears. In a way, it's not so evident. But what the Crutchley books is doing is making us realise that all these dyes, colours they created were multiple, really complicated in terms of how they were building up the colour, and just getting us to think differently about these textiles, and also giving us evidence of what these textiles are, because there are not many wool cloths from British dyers that exist that have got these colours on them anymore. They are now in the Crutchley archive. Didn't always go well. They also noted things that they failed in. So working with tin spirits, I mentioned it had to be made in a certain kind of way. They talked about spotting. So if they got an alkali onto the cloth during the processing of it, they got these white spots. I don't know if you can sort of see very faintly in the top little sample there, some white spots there. That was, you know, not good. They could get colours darkening as they dried them, for example, poor colours out of grain if not done correctly. They all mention it there, so it's a very practical insight to it. So that is the Crutchley archive. I'm going to stop it there. It is, hopefully you can sort of see how, well, how excited I am about it, that it means such a lot. Hopefully you can sort of see the colour creation without knowing what the chemistry is, but look what they were doing. It's quite a marvellous thing. I'm just really pleased to be able to share that with you today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. Another wonderful talk, a very colourful talk, if I may say so. And it's amazing how unfaded the dyes are. It shows us effectively the dyes as they were at the time, because of course, if we're looking at 18th century clothes now, they've all been faded or discoloured or whatever. So absolutely fascinating from that point of view. One comment I would make about that lovely chart you show near the end, but you have purple there, and in fact you've got purple in the middle of this final picture here, and that absolutely knocks on the head the theory that was common 40, 50 years ago, that the whole point of synthetic dye is that they introduced colours for the first time into fashion, which we now know is complete nonsense, and your talk shows that we didn't have to wait for Perkin to have purple, so that's very useful too. This is a remarkable collection, of course. How many similar collections are there? I mean, are there any other collections like this? I mean, there's the Mercer collection in Oxford, of course, but that's 100 years later.
Yeah, there's a wonderful collection in Exeter which has had a marvelous book written about it, which is it's called the Dispatched collection. So it's a collection of cloths that are merchants passing on. So they've got books with samples of the cloths as they were being packaged up and sent on, but not the dyeing part of it. But that's an absolutely marvelous collection, a really excellent one for seeing the colours that have been exported from Exeter, which is like a very important, really big part of this story. There's Wallbridge, I think it is. There's some dyers books there. I think they're mostly blue and indigo dyed. The ones that I was looking at the National Archive looked, dare I say, I don't mean this bad, but they look like the colours that you'd get from the fluff you get in your vacuum cleaner. So sort of greys and browns and quite sort of muted colours. But I think that's because they were dyeing the fibres to blend and mix them into a certain kind of cloth, which the name's gone out of my head, but I'll remember in a moment. So there's nothing quite as colourful as what we've seen here. So there's odd books here and there that are out of context. But now we've got a context for Crutchley, we can try to sort of like see how these other books and other things that, who knows what's sitting in people's collections at home. You know, this came out of somebody's attic or, you know, it's just about spreading the word.
Well, actually, in a way, you've raised another question I was going to ask, and that is, you say that the family gave the 15 volumes to Southwark. Did they hold on to any? Is that the whole collection?
It's as far as we know. They were very excited to know that it had meaning to it. I think there are a few samples that are associated with like letters and things like that, which are much more kind of business orientated. There might well be things in their collection, Peter, but as far as we know, these were the things that they felt were most precious and the most colourful. So yeah, I think that's them.
Sorry, there's just so many things I could ask here. You mentioned that, I think you mentioned at one point that your access has somehow been restricted more recently. Is that because it's a UNESCO collection now? Does that put limitations on what you can do with it?
Yeah, it's about a preservation sort of thing. So the interesting thing is that the second that I saw those books way back in June 2014 and Patricia was taking them out of the box, my head split into two thoughts. My head went, oh, these amazing colours for dye analysis and looking at the materials, and how am I going to help her to preserve them and look after it and manage the collection? Because as we've found, there's so much interest in this collection that it needs very carefully managed, because you mentioned there the colours were so beautifully preserved. You know, putting them on display to let them be accessed, for them to be studied, could damage some of the colors, particularly I mentioned these yellow dyes that have made these very nuanced colors, logwood and Brazilwood as well. These are very ephemeral colors. They're very easily degraded by daylight, and even under a very managed environment in a museum or an archive, the special lighting that's in there's no UV in the light, there's no daylight, can still have potential for damaging the colors. So it's about working with Southwark to look at what's possible to do, but digitizing them and making them available as photographs to read the words is a very good thing, and that we've been working towards. The actual physical getting to the samples is going to have to be making a very, as you probably know from the Science Museum, you know, that sort of like request, the special request, and the process of having that approval for somebody to take samples or whatever. So in that sense of, we were just like there day in, day out, just like going through the books, looking at them like really close. Now we'll have to ourselves apply to have special access to them.
Mm. So you still have full access to them yourself?
Yeah, yes, I think we get a slight privilege to do it, but I still would have to make sure I got the permission to do it. Before we would just say, Patricia, we're coming next week, can we see them? Like, yeah, I'll get them out the cupboard for you, or not the cupboard, but out the store for you. But yeah, now it's a bit more long.
Okay, now I've got a couple of sort of technical questions, and then we'll get on to the questions that have been put, of which there are a few. Now that's it, but you talk a lot about chemistry. Were the Crutchleys and the workers chemically trained in any way themselves, or did they just learn it on the job, so to speak?
I think they must have learnt it on the job, and I think it'll be that, again, just thinking about that wonderful training that a lot of us that have had, you know, that real sort of practiced at the lab bench, and just, you know, the good old fashioned, you know, sort of chemistry of like, you know, maybe the inorganic lectures or something like that we would have had. I think it's just that sort of knowing that, don't know why it's doing it, but I know that if I use this dye with this combination of things, I can get this color from it. So there's a lot of sort of trading of that information within the profession. And it took somebody like Drebel to come along, and again, that I suppose the Enlightenment really wasn't happening for like another 100 years or so in terms of that scientific layer going on to what was happening. And certainly by the, you know, sort of late 1700s into the 19th century, there's much more kind of experimentation trying to explain things. But I think this was all practice-based, tacit knowledge about, if you do this, it works, and if you don't, it doesn't. Yeah.
Did they have any contact with chemists themselves?
I don't know. I mean, they are in London. They're based in Southwark. I don't know. I don't know what that relationship is. We were supported for this by, sorry, I should go to the last thank you thing, which is like the Worshipful Company of Dyers supported our work. So, you know, that, and they were very brilliant for giving us information, but I'm sure there's much more there, and all those sort of different companies, you know, companies that were there, to their connections and Mercers and
Who think maybe, I mean, what about Peter Wolf? I mean, Peter Wolf invented the dye himself. He was in the Inns of Court, which was across the river from Southwark. One wonders, that might be an interesting angle. That might be an interesting angle to sort of look into.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing that struck me is that you talked about the Lycian dyes, and when I think of Lycian dyes, I immediately think of the famous Cuthbert, who invented
Mr. Cuthbert. Yes, yes.
Now, did they have any contact with the Cuthbert?
Quite. I'm sure that that sort of Cuthbert dyeing comes out of this. I mean, it becomes a big thing. Well, wonderfully up in Glasgow, you know, the Cuthbert industry on the east end of Glasgow becomes a big thing for that. And I suppose, I mean, lichens can grow in many different places, but you know, Scotland's was quite plentiful in what it supplied at that time. Also, like anything that's sort of like Atlantic coastline seems to be the thing. So the sort of Gallic countries or areas of like France and Portugal.
The thing you see, I mean, apart from the dyeing, apart from the incidental chemistry, you've also got very important trade network, don't you? Because you've got the imports of colouring materials like Brazil wood, logwood,
Yeah,
and also I mean, presumably the Cuthbert exported some of their dyes.
I
Was
think they
that
did.
trade
It
in dye?
must, yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I think that was for wool. There was quite a lot of trade of like importing things from America and then sending things back that way. That was mostly sort of kind of cotton. Well, obviously they sent wool back as well, but that sort of cotton and cotton printing and dyeing, and then wool tended to go more kind of west or east rather into Europe. But yeah, I suppose that whole trade. And like I said, the Crutchleys weren't unique in what they were doing. They were just one of many that we just don't have much information for. So, Nova Scotia, for example, I think they were doing that. So, again, those kind of connections with traditions that people moved. I mean, that we're doing some quite fascinating PhD research at the minute about like what happens when people sort of like change and the diaspora moves around. What dyes do they use as alternatives to things that they are culturally and historically used to using when they're in different places? So like Nova Scotians, Canada, for example, if someone is using Cudbear and the Cuthbert methods, they might well be wanting that to be, exported out to them. So yeah, there's a whole trade network in there as well.
Okay, I've got one more question before I go on to the good questions we've got online, because we have at least a couple of good questions, possibly more to be passed on to you online. But you talk about the tin spirit, and you talk about how you make tin spirit. It becomes yellow, but I'm sort of thinking, well, tin salts are colourless, lead salts are colourless, so why is it yellow?
I think they make tin oxides. So it's interesting because in the 19th century, right up until like the start of the 20th century, they were still using sort of tin mordants, but by now it's become like tin chlorides. But it seems like it's a mystery that we need to, there's a bit of recreational I love doing these recreations, these sort of reenactments of the dying. Yeah, it needs to get done.
Anita, you brought me on to the first of our viewer questions, because one of our viewer questions is, have you ever tried to reproduce any of this yourself?
Yeah, we haven't done the Crutchley yet. We've been
out there, presumably. Can you reproduce any of this stuff?
Yeah, we can do. We've done aspects of it in different projects, but I'm working up to trying to get a large tranche of money now to do something very concerted with this. Dominique Cardon is a marvelous person in many ways, and she's been working a lot with textile design, like fashion designers currently, so working with students and different fashion design courses and programs in the UK and France and Europe and much further afield globally to reenact and recreate these things. So we're quite careful about how we phrase it, because there is this sort of like reproducing element of it as well. And when I was in the archive, the very first time I saw it and was going down myself before Dominique and Jenny came to join me, in that reading room at Southwark, there were people from the London College of Fashion and the lecturers and things like that, and they'd come over and get, what are you looking at? It's getting you so excited, and aren't these colours amazing to recreate? So there's our interest from the sort of history of the materials to recreate it, and the fashion industry today would love to be part of that too. So Dominique's already got amazing connections and ways of doing that, and it just needs a really big project to kind of bring all that creativity together, and I think we could get some marvelous things. And then we'll have references that we can drill down into a bit more with the chemistry.
Now, one of the questions from our viewers is that you talked about pH, but how could they sort of measure the pH? How could they control? I mean, they could control it, of course, but how could they know about it? I mean, of course, they didn't know about it in pH, but how did they test for pH?
They did it visually. I think they might have done a little bit of tasting. I'm not sure, they don't actually mention it, but I know that taste goes quite a lot into the 19th century about like dipping your tongue into all sorts of things that we wouldn't do today. But it seems to be visual. They'll say, at this point, the color will get to this level, or they did it by time. because they're working with natural materials and they had all their different variances, it wasn't a scripted thing, which is why they write almost every time they do it, they kind of repeat the recipe. But it was about, it is a remarkable thing. They somehow were able to tell the quality of the dye stuff to know the proportions of things as well. So they had to sort of guesstimate how much madder to use with how much quantity of, you know, how many pailfuls of or ladlefuls of tin spirits and how much weight of argol to add into that. And they did, that's where the expertise came in. And that must have been built on like millennia of people dyeing with natural dyes and just being really expert, not just in the UK, but globally, that inherited understanding. So yeah, it's visual. It is remarkable.
Anita, I want to move on here because we've had two questions which I can amalgamate here. No green or blue. Why?
I know. Because the dyers specialised in different colours. So the Crutchleys specialised in reds. The top of the tree were the indigo dyers in London at the time. So they were like the real kind of thing, because it was such, well, they had to keep the dye vats going. They had to sort of like get the, you know, it was quite a complicated process to do that. Again, from a chemical perspective. Then it kind of went down the levels. So you got like scarlet dyers, you've got people that did all the colours in their range down to black. And I think black was because you could colour combine all sorts of things. In terms of colour creation, maybe wasn't quite so skillful, but still needed care to preserve the fibres because they could damage it. But yeah, there was a hierarchy of colour. That's that whole art of dyeing, which is a digitised book. Whole Art of Dyeing, 1706. You can get it through the Internet Archive and all these digitized book sources. Reading through that's quite fascinating because it does have this, explains it.
That wasn't, to emphasise, it wasn't a technical issue. It was a conscious decision they made not to go into those colours.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. They just had quite a defined group of materials that they used. And I think that's perhaps where their skill was built up. Thomas Crutchley would have been...
Another question I've got here. What are the dark lines through the fabric samples? I think you've got in the picture here, you're on the left. What all that about? Is that gluing them to the paper or something?
No, this is a very great question. This is a coding that the dyers used. They call it listing. So it gets very confusing when Dominique and Jenny and I were talking about lists of things. We have to be quite specific, meaning like a list of lines of information, or the lists, which is these colours. So it's usually done with in France they used indigo. They would sometimes dye some yarn and then stitch it into the edge of the selvage edge of the cloth. And it was a coding of talking about the quality of the cloth. So I think that because of the next stage on for the merchanting side of it was the quality of the cloth and the costs of the cloth based on the quality and the kind of wool that they were doing or cloth they were using. So those lines are a coding system for that. And again, this is really rare. They do not survive that often, but Dominique was super excited because she's only seen a small number of them. So yeah, that's what they are. Really, yeah, really good question. Very rare.
Very good. Now you mentioned in fact these books have been digitally scanned. Is that right?
Yes. At the moment,
is that going to be available for people?
Hopefully so. I know there used to be quite a lot of money about 10 years ago for archives and libraries to digitize collections, just like go at it and do it. That's quite rare now, and we've got to make a really strong funding case to get that kind of digitizing done. So at the moment, Patricia has been taking, like we've been giving our research images to Patricia. I think there's a plan to do it. The pandemic stopped so much, it sort of held us back for like a couple of years in that process, and other things have become more kind of pertinent, I suppose. But yeah, we would very much like to make it much more widely available in that sense. Yeah.
Yes. Anne Green here asked a very, very broad question, which we don't really have time for now. But what was happening in dyeing in other parts of the world at the time?
Yeah, well, in that period, so I had a PhD student who was looking at traditional dyeing in China at that time, and I very naively, and it just shows you the sort of very westernized view we can have of things. I thought, she was looking at court status silk textiles being dyed in China. Jing was able to go and use the archives and to look at documentation, and had many marvelous collaborative things to analyze historical samples from dyed textiles. And I expected, it'll be Western dyes would end up infiltrating into China, but China was quite not adamant, but like they were very much using dyes that are quite specific to them. So things like something called the Amur cork tree for yellows, oh gosh, I can't remember all the different dyes now, but like it was quite a specific dyeing tradition, but use them in quite sort of similar ways. So a lot of these techniques have been translated across different cultures. Quite a lot of information was passed between like Asia and Europe, for example. Yeah, it's global. The thing about this wonderful area is you find that you break down all sorts of notions about internationalization and globalization. This is all happening, as you know, I'm sure, as well, centuries before we've kind of voiced it. Yeah.
I mean, this might be a good opportunity to ask, and I think we should maybe end here. What about your other students? I mean, you've got students working on other topics as well, don't you? And some colleagues of yours are working, for example, on turkey red.
Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned Julie Wirtz, so she was doing a recreation project looking at turkey red. There's an oil that gets used called turkey red oil. And it turned out that it still had, well, I don't know if it's still, maybe it is still used in the plastics industry, but it was certainly getting used up into the 1950s. And when she was publishing about this oil, which is the rancid olive oil, she had to get a special bottle of it sent across from some olive vineyard, if for a better word, in south of France, sent a very special bottle of rancid olive oil to Julie, and she did a whole lot of really cool sort of NMR analysis and mass spec on it, and published that. And she was getting people from the plastics industries going, "You've made it real. We didn't know what this thing was. We just know we used it. We just didn't know what it was or why." So yeah, so she was recreating this and the transition from going from natural madder into alizarin, which is one of the first synthetic dyes that overtook this. Recreating it. I've got two PhD students at the moment. One, Katie, who's looking at the recreation of James Morton's light fire sundower dyes, and looking at those and their use for cotton. And I've got another student called Charlene, who is looking at this translation of dyes from Africa moving with the enslaved to Suriname, and that thing about what do you do when you are no longer with your dye sources, but you still want to create colour, and it's very spiritually important in the 18th century. So that's another recreation project about looking at the colours that could be created there. So yeah, that's very much the flavour of what we do at Glasgow, and we use, like I said, analytical chemical techniques to look at the materials of what we're doing, but it's very much practice-based and looking at it from this art historical perspective. Makes it wonderful.
Oh, you've given me the names of two possible future speakers there. I've already been
absolutely delighted.
Well, so we must keep going in a way. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Anita. A very colourful, wonderful talk, and it was so good to have you with us today. Don't forget, next month we've got Anne Green talking about a pioneering pathological chemist. I'll be telling you more about that in my next email. If anybody has any ideas for something in December, I would like to hear from you, because I've rather run out of Christmas-related topics. Normally I give a Christmas-related talk myself, but frankly, the well is dry. So if anybody's got a good idea for a talk for Christmas, I would like to hear it. Finally, The X-ray crystallography meeting, British X-ray crystallography, next month, Burlington House, 18th of October. Only 4 places left. So if you want to come to this wonderful meeting, register now. So only remains to me to thank Anita again, and thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you again next month. Bye for now. Bye, Anita.